Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and you've found your way to Kinda Murdery, a place that means more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories, the unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery. Hey everybody, welcome to Kinda Murdery. I'm your host, Zevin Odelberg. Thank you for deciding to be here. You've done it. You've made it to part 2, the thrilling conclusion of License to Die, the strange case of Harvey Church. So if you haven't heard part 1 yet, go back and listen to it and then rejoin us. And if you have heard it, well then let's get right to it. Let's hit the road, Jack, if you will. It is time to make like beloved Eddie Munson and heavy metal. Kinda Murdery starts now. Since you have nothing, perhaps I can help things a little. Well, what do you mean? Cartwright asked, looking at me in surprise. I mean, Hickey replied with keen enjoyment of the surprise he was about to spring, that the body of the murdered man was found in the Des Plaines River near Maywood by 2 Boy Scouts this morning. The body is now in the custody of the police, and although they probably will fail to identify it owing to the disfiguration, I have every reason to believe, and I am positive, that it is James Doherty. Well, what makes you think so? Exclaimed Cartwright, his eyes wide with wonder. Did you know Doherty? No, Hickey replied. I didn't know him, but I found these papers in one of the man's pockets, and they seem to make the identification certain. Hickey handed the documents over to Cartwright, who scrutinized the envelope and paper carefully. By George, he said, I bet you're right. But if these papers were on the body, how is it that the identity is not already known to the police? When I found out who the man was, I replied, or who I thought he was, and that it was apparent that he'd been murdered, I figured that the less known of his identity just yet, the better. Should the man who killed him read that an unidentified man had been found, he will feel safe, and probably will not take the precautions to cover up his trail that he might under different circumstances. Well, that's so too, agreed Cartwright. What's on your mind now? What do you propose to do? There's only one thing to do. Notify the police, I answered. I'm not a detective, and the affair is nothing to me, but I've been in the game long enough to know that criminals, a lot of them, base their activities on newspaper reports as to what the movements of the police are. So far, this has been kept in the dark. My only purpose in coming to you first, or at all, before notifying the police, was to learn if you might have something to add to the case. Cartwright called the police department, and before long, 2 plainclothes men who'd previously been assigned to the case were ushered in. Cartwright introduced them to Hickey and Cousin Otis as Detective John Noonan and Walter Shoemaker, and proceeded to relate Hickey's story to them. Hickey had described as best he could, from the appearance of the body, what the dead man looked like, and Cartwright declared the description, in a general way, fitted Doherty. The 2 detectives said that the department had been notified of the finding of the man's body, but of course had no notion as to who it might be. And now that we're all together, Hickey said, when the police had finished and he had answered several questions put to him by the officers, here's another point. After leaving Maywood this morning, Cousin Otis and I drove to the church home and had a talk with the tenant upstairs. He's just gotten back from a business trip. Now, I wasn't trying to butt in on the police, but I'm a newspaper writer and I guess just naturally newsy, and I knew that regardless of whether I saw Church or not, I wouldn't be doing any harm. Hickey then told them the result of his conversation with Ross, following which there was a general discussion all around. He learned that Cartwright was aware that Church was out of town. Church had been into the office the day before, asking if anything had been heard of the 2 men, and telling Cartwright that he was leaving with his mother for a brief trip to his father's farm up near Addison. Hickey also learned that a thorough check on Church's cash payment for the automobile story had been made by the police. They had learned that he'd made a large withdrawal from the Continental and Commercial Trust and Savings Bank where he kept his account on the day previous to the purchase of the machine. In a roundabout way, so as not to hurt the man standing, they learned that he was held in high regard by the firm for which he worked. He recently had received a commission check for bond sales which, with the amount he had withdrawn from the bank, made a total of considerably more than had been paid to the salesman. The officers did not take so much stock in the fact that Ross had not seen Osmus and Doherty leave the church home upon returning from the Indiana harbor, and Hickey agreed with them. The police were inclined to believe that Doherty had met foul play at the hands of Osmus, either in an attempt to retain possession of the money paid him for the company, or as the result of a falling out among thieves. This conjecture was not illogical. One thing, however, which they admitted puzzled them was the handcuff around Doherty's wrist. Only one bracelet of the pair had been locked on the dead man's arm. The other was missing. "We've investigated this fellow Church pretty thoroughly," declared Detective Noonan at length, "and I'm satisfied he's not in this. So far, though, we've been working on a hunch, and we've got nothing. Doherty's body has been found. Now, that makes several things possible. It may be that he and Osmus had some quarrel, and then Osmus killed him and beat it with the money, or it may be that both of them were murdered and thrown in the river, and that Osmus is still there. Now, what this bird Ross did or didn't see might not make any difference, and then again, it might, but I'll tell you what we might do. We might take a run out to Church's house and sort of look things over on the quiet." "What do you mean, search the house without permission?" asked Shoemaker. "Well, sure," agreed Noonan. That sounded pretty high-handed to Hickey, breaking into a man's home without a warrant, and I guess it must have sounded the same way to Shoemaker, for he seemed doubtful. "After we ransack this guy's house and find nothing, what then? A sweet bawling from the chief for disobeying orders and maybe suspension. I'm not strong for it," said Shoemaker. Noonan put up an argument, probably more from a desire to win his point than any wish to search the church home, and in the end he prevailed. Hickey left his car in the company garage, and they all drove out in the police machine, stopping en route at a newsstand where they secured a copy of the Chicago American Noon edition, which contained the story of the unidentified murder victim found in the Des Plaines River. Arriving at the church house, the police went at once to the Ross apartment, and after a long interview with that man, decided that come what may, they were going to search Church's home. Entrance was made by means of a pass key through the kitchen door, which, though locked, had not been fastened with the night bolt from the inside. The apartment was in spick-and-span order and very tastefully furnished. A very thorough search in which the officers exercised care not to disturb the order of the place failed to reveal anything that would connect young Church with the disappearance of the two men. In a small metal box in what was evidently Church's den, police found a receipt for the car and the carbon copy of the original and smeared agreement taken from Doherty's body. The place was as barren of clues as a hen of its proverbial teeth. "I think we better get out of this joint and get out pronto," declared Shoemaker, who was plainly ill at ease. "We'd be a fine-looking company if those folks should walk in the front door now, wouldn't we?" Then, turning to Noonan, who was opening and shutting doors and creating a general racket, "What are you snooping around for now?" "Maybe we're up on the wrong foot," declared Noonan, "but while we're here, we might as well make a good job of it. There must be a basement door somewhere. Yes, here we are." Noonan opened a door that led off the short hallway connecting the kitchen and the dining room and said, "Come on, everybody." Hickey, Cousin Otis, and the police tripped down a flight of narrow stairs and found themselves in a pit of impenetrable blackness. Stumbling and feeling his way about with the aid of his pocket torch, Detective Noonan finally discovered the electric switch, and a moment later, the basement was flooded with light. The search there was a short duration. Revelations came so thick and fast as to leave everyone paralyzed with amazement. We'll find out why after the break. Hey everybody, we're back. Thank you so much for taking a moment to support the brands who support Kinda Murdery. As you know, I have cerebral palsy, and in fact, my wife has fibromyalgia, so we are a family of disabled people, and it's important to me that our community, that Kinda Murdery, is a forum to share the stories of people with disabilities, physical or otherwise, and everyone whose story might be outside of the norm and something that most people are not often exposed to. So, if you'd like to make a connection, if you'd like to tell your story, please do reach out to me at kindamurdery@gmail.com or at kindamurdery on all social media and share your story. And if you'd like me to share it with everybody on the show, I will. If you'd like to keep it between us, we can do that too. I'd also like to take a moment to remind you of the number 988. Please do program it into your phone. It's a new, free, 3-digit number, 988, that you can dial to immediately connect with a counselor, with someone who cares, to talk about substance use, mental health, or suicidal thoughts. So, if you're in acute crisis, please do call 988 and immediately be connected with someone to talk to. And please do, please remember always that this world is a better place with you in it. Now, if you're not in acute crisis, but you'd just like to talk to someone, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Again, that's kindamurdery@gmail.com or @kindamurdery on all social media. I'd like to share with you guys an email I received from a listener that really meant the world to me, and I would like to commend her for her bravery, for being courageous enough to share her story with me, and by extension with all of you and with everybody. It really does take courage, and I just can't tell you how moved I am by the fact that the community that we're all building together is there to actually help someone in their time of need. So, with her permission, I would like to now share with you an email from a woman named Sarah who reached out to me via kindamurdery@gmail.com, which is where you should reach out to me too, if you'd like to, or most especially, if you need to. And Sarah, thank you so much for being brave enough to demonstrate to everyone that it is okay to do this. It's okay to reach out to me. I want you to if you need to. So here is what Sarah has to say. The subject of the email is Why I Heart K.M. Why I Love Kinda Murdery. And Sarah writes, I love Kinda Murdery for so many reasons, and here are some. I live with fibromyalgia and PTSD, and it is absolutely wonderful to hear efforts to recognize and normalize the conversation. Thank you, Sarah. As I just mentioned, my wife has fibromyalgia as well, and I'm intimately acquainted with just how difficult it can be. So my heart goes out to you on that. Again, thank you for sharing with us. All right, enough editorializing by me. Back to Sarah's email. She says, I live with fibromyalgia and PTSD, and it's absolutely wonderful to hear efforts to recognize and normalize the conversation. She says, I caught the episode with your daughter Daisy in it, and thanks to her, I now use these nuts in conversation with my children every day. They absolutely hate it. It's glorious. Your voices and wit and style are so fun and easy to listen to. Again, you're too kind, Sarah. Thank you. She says, I'm from southern Missouri, and I loved your telling of Bonnie and Clyde. And guess what? I also loved the movie The Highwayman. And then she said, and this is the part that made me misty-eyed, she said, including the 988 number in your show, put it firmly enough in my mind to bring it up to me as I was struggling with self-harm recently. The phone call surely saved me some scars and physical healing. So much love and appreciation. Again, Sarah, I'm sure it wasn't easy, but thank you for sharing your story with all of us. Of course, I hope that no one is ever in a position to harm themselves, but I do know that it happens, and I pray that Sarah's story and the chance to share it with all of you can help someone else to find a different way to process their pain. So she finishes by saying, that's just a few of the reasons I love the show. You're awesome and helping so many people. Keep up the good work. Sarah. P.S. Feel free to share on the show if you'd like. I will not be miffed if you do not. Smiley face. Of course, I'll share it on the show, and I just did. And again, I'm thrilled that you reached out. I'm thrilled that our community could help. And it's not just me, it's not just the show, but it's all of you. All of you who listen. One guy talking into a microphone doesn't make a community, doesn't make a support system, but all of us together do. So thank you to all of you. This is therapeutic for me. Thank you, Sarah, for sharing it with us that we were able to help you. And everyone, take a little piece of that gratitude for yourselves, because it's for all of us. It's for all of us. And please do tell people about the show, leave reviews. The more visible we can be, the better chance we have to grow our community and hopefully be there again when, God forbid, someone else needs the support. So thank you, Sarah, for reaching out. I appreciate it so much. All right, and with that, let's get back to License to Die, the strange tale of Harvey Church. As always, I'll rewind the story just a bit to allow you to settle back into the narrative. Kinda Murdery resumes now. Stumbling and feeling his way about with the aid of his pocket torch, Detective Noonan finally discovered the electric switch, and a moment later, the basement was flooded with light. The search there was a short duration. Revelations came so thick and fast as to leave everyone paralyzed with amazement. The entire rear end of the basement between the coal bin and the stairs leading to the yard bore evidences of a terrible struggle. The floor and the walls in this area were literally covered with bloodstains. Following this discovery, the police began their efforts in earnest, and presently Shoemaker emerged from the dark interior of the coal bin carrying a blood-stained quilt wrapped about a double-bladed timber axe besmeared with the telltale stains. Almost simultaneously, Noonan, who had been flashing his light under the cellar, gave a cry and dragged out a bundle similar to that found by Shoemaker. Unrolling it on the floor, they found it to be a suit of clothes of light gray material with great dark brown splotches down the front of the coat and pants. The suit had been wrapped around a blood-stained hammer and a baseball bat, to the end of which clung wisps of matted hair. So shocking were these discoveries, and so utterly surprised was everyone at finding them, that they were all speechless. Nor was the evidence that now lay piled up on the floor all that the basement revealed. Pawing through a box of junk in the corner, Hickey found a salesman's manual bearing Doherty's name, and not to be outdone by the others, Otis and Cartwright, who were on a little expedition of their own, produced a dark fedora hat containing the letters CAA, Auspice's initials, and a brown cap, which Cartwright immediately identified as belonging to Doherty. Nothing more was revealed by the search. Nothing more was needed. The evidence was complete, and yet it was evidence that would make one stop and wonder. Even the most amateurish criminal or murderer, especially the latter, through instinct alone it would seem, would have made an effort to dispose of nearly as possible every scrap of evidence that possibly might incriminate him. Here, the men had found initialed hats, clubs, clothes, an axe, and a quilt, each in itself a document of horror, and on top of these, the stained floor and walls, on which not the slightest effort had been made to efface the marks. It appeared that the murderer, in a frenzy of fear, had sought to hide his guilt by hurling the damning tools of his work helter-skelter at any spot that offered a hiding place, much as a child might throw a dish it has broken under the sink. "This sure is one hell of a business," Noonan declared when at last they'd laid their various finds out on the floor in a motley heap. "I'm thinking it spells a rope for Mr. Church to my way of reasoning. Doherty and Osmus were trapped down here and slain. And that handcuff bracelet ain't a puzzle to me anymore. When he'd finished with this dastardly business, Church drove the bodies of these men to some point along the Des Plaines River. He handcuffed their wrists together, and the probability is that he tied a piece of stone to the leg of one of them and threw him in the river. I believe those handcuffs broke, allowing Doherty's body to float to the shallow spot where it was found, and the remains of Osmus will be found in deeper water." "That was the wisest thing you ever did, arguing with me against coming here," Noonan continued, addressing Shoemaker. "I wasn't particular about coming out, and I didn't expect to find anything if we did come. But when you talked against it, I got stubborn and insisted on having my way. Had you agreed to it readily in the first place, the chances are we wouldn't have come. My God, if there's one thing I can't understand, it's why that damn fool didn't dispose of this stuff. He could have left this place as bare of evidence as the floor above had he had any brains. But we got a lot of work to do. Let's get busy. We can talk later." The machinery of the law was immediately put into action. Within the hour, in response to a telephone call to headquarters by Noonan, a deputy coroner, accompanied by several detectives and a representative of the state attorney's office, had arrived, carefully examined the premises, and made photographs of the basement and the evidence found. The bloody relics were then appropriated by the state's attorney's representative for safekeeping and presentations to the grand jury. Stepping back from the story here for a moment, I gotta say I am really curious how the heck they're gonna get around the illegal search and seizure part of the discovery of this evidence. Alright, back to the story. In the meantime, a wire had been dispatched to the chief of police at Addison, Wisconsin, ordering the immediate apprehension of Harvey Church. He was arrested driving in the streets of Addison, accompanied by his mother and father, and though extradition papers had already been issued, it was learned, somewhat to the surprise of the police, that Church would not fight being brought back to Cook County. It was first suspected that he had not been made aware of the nature of the charges against him, but this was later discovered to be wrong. Once started on a clue, the police worked with remarkable rapidity. Before nightfall, squads from the town hall station in Chicago were busily engaged dragging the Des Plaines River around the vicinity where Doherty's body had been found, in an effort to bring the body of Osmus to the surface. With the first definite knowledge that Church was safely under arrest, the information was released to the papers that the man found in the river was Doherty. and thousands of persons from Chicago and the near vicinity crowded the riverbanks watching the officers work. The following morning, Harvey Church was brought under heavy guard from Addison, Wisconsin. He was taken immediately to the office of the state attorney, where, after brief and unimportant preliminary questioning, he was accused of the murder of both Dougherty and Osmus, and faced with the evidence of his guilt. During the first part of the interrogation, Church made brief and, for the most part, unsatisfactory answers to the questions put to him, but in sight of the bloody relics he shut up like a clam and seemed stunned. When pressed harder, he became impatient and made a vehement denial of having anything whatsoever to do with the killing of the two men, if killed they indeed were. In view of what lay piled on the table before him, the bat, the axe, the hammer, the quilt, and other articles found, all bearing the telltale bloodstains, and so close that had he reached out his hand he could have touched them, this line of argument was extremely ridiculous. However, any surprise that his stand may have caused those in the room was as nothing as compared to that which came when, pressed harder and harder for a confession, he suddenly made an astounding declaration. He admitted that which had been found in the basement of his home placed him in a, quote, very embarrassing position, but said that if he really had killed the two men, he had absolutely no recollection of the deed. To the authorities, this statement carried about as much weight as his flat denial of any knowledge of the affair had, but, argue and threaten as they might, he could not be persuaded or intimidated to change the statement a bit, nor did 3 days of merciless grilling suffice to break him down. In the meantime, having failed in their efforts to locate Osmus's body by probing or with grappling hooks, the police began dynamiting the river at many spots where the water was quite deep and where they thought it was likely the corpse might be. But this, too, proved equally futile. Having denied any knowledge of the murders, and having declared that if he had done the deed he didn't remember it, it was hardly natural to suppose that Church would shed any light on the whereabouts of Osmus's body. This guess proved correct. Approached on the subject, he gave a bored laugh. "In view of the fact that I know nothing of the affair, how could I be supposed to know where the man's body is?" he inquired. For the time being, the authorities decided to leave him alone and pursue their own course. With Dougherty's mutilated body and the instruments of the terrible deed in hand, they had enough evidence to assure a conviction, but they wanted, if possible, to make the case absolutely complete. In this, they suddenly were successful. Detectives Noonan and Shoemaker were still chasing down clues in the case. They made a second visit to the Church residence and talked again with Ross as well as nearby neighbors, but without success. Now, it happens that while the automobile which Church had purchased was in the hands of the police, it was stored under lock and key in the garage at the rear of Church's home. As it was a remarkably beautiful machine, the only one of its kind in the city, the detectives went to the garage simply to look it over before returning to the station. Noonan was attracted to one corner of the large room where the concrete flooring showed signs of having been recently pulled up, probably for a plumbing repair to some pipe underneath. Noonan and Shoemaker poked about the broken cement, and were suddenly rewarded with the discovery of bloodstains. Grabbing up a shovel and a crowbar that were in the garage, they fell to work, and before long, the disfigured body of Carl Osmus had been exhumed. With the last link of the case complete, the authorities again went at Church with renewed vigor, and succeeded in drawing from him a signed confession. But their efforts were time wasted, as the contents of the confession were of such a nature that the state declined to use it as part of its case, nor did the defense try to introduce its substance into court at the time of trial. It is without a doubt one of the most peculiar and strange documents ever entered in the criminal history of Cook County. Here is what Harvey Church wrote. "All of my life I have been a peculiar sort of fellow. I have known it, but whether or not others did, I have no means of telling. But a peculiarity that one sees in oneself must certainly be apparent to others. I was born and brought up in Addison, Wisconsin. I was just like other boys, full of mischief and always ready for a frolic. As a young child, I was not vicious, but growing older, I would have spells when I wanted to kill. Not a very commendable quality, to be sure, but the truth, nevertheless. I used to torture insects and small animals. Of course, when I grew to be 17 or 18, I practically got over this, and even when I was overcome with this emotion, I wouldn't think of going out and killing a dog or a cat. I never knew what hatred against a human being meant, and my inclinations were never directed toward persons. Then came this dreadful affair, a horrible nightmare to me. I had been earning good money, and I wanted to buy a car. I looked at several makes, but decided on the one that I was driving when arrested. Both Dougherty and Osmus had been trying to sell me for weeks, and I got to such a state finally that I could think of nothing but that machine. It was a very beautiful automobile, equipped with all modern appliances. The price was $8,000. It was considerably more than I had planned to pay, but I had set my mind on it, and I decided that I just must have it. On the day that Doherty and Osmus died, I'd been out riding with them, giving the car a final tryout. On the spur of the moment, I decided to take it and told them to drive me home and I would make out a check. We drove up an alley and into a garage, and I left them while I went for my checkbook. When I returned, I found that Doherty had already made out a receipt. Then, of a sudden, came the impulse. Things went red before my eyes, and great drops of perspiration broke out all over my body. If I could only get them to my house and into the basement, the car would be mine, and I would have the receipt to show for it. Then I could cash a check for $6,000 and bury or hide the money to make my story hang together. I gave Doherty the check and then invited the two over to the house to have a drink. When we arrived, we went down to the basement where I had several bottles of liquor. We each had a number of drinks, and from that time on, things are very indistinct in my memory. I attacked the men with the axe. Doherty fell at once, and even though Osmus attempted to defend himself, my assault was so sudden and terrific that he was unprepared and he had no chance. When it was all over, I waited until nightfall to hide the bodies. I intended to throw both bodies into the river and handcuff them together for that purpose. Then, the weight was too great for me to carry, so I severed the cuffs and buried Osmus in my garage under the floor. There wasn't enough room in the hole for Doherty, so I had to take him to the river, though I realized I was in great danger of being caught. I drove out to the Dempster Road Bridge over the river at a spot where I knew the water to be fairly deep. Then I tied a rock to one of Doherty's legs and threw him in the water. First, however, I removed all traces of identification, but I must have missed the additional inside pocket in his coat. I drove around all night, and in the morning I went to the Indiana harbor for my mother and sweetheart. On the way back, I stopped at the bank and withdrew several $1,000s. That same day, the police visited my house looking for Doherty and Osmus, and you know the rest from then on. Damning though it was, the state's attorney declined to use Church's confession in court. Though he never expressed a reason for this, it's generally believed that he feared the confession had too much the smack of insanity to present to the jury. On the 18th of December, Church was placed on trial and, true to predictions, used insanity as his defense. But, despite the testimony given by Miss Anna Barrett, his fiancé, her father, Charles Roby, hotel proprietor, and Dan Willard, both of Addison, Wisconsin, to the effect that at times Church suffered mental lapses, and the testimony of Dr. Hugh T. Patrick, specialist in mental diseases, that Church was inclined to be a victim of amnesia, he was found guilty, and on December 23rd, in criminal court before Judge Caverly, famous trial judge of the Loeb Leopold case, he was condemned to be hanged. Church's execution was set for February 17th, but was subsequently extended to March 3rd for a further investigation into his sanity, which proved futile. Even with the execution date extended to March 3rd, because there was so much doubt as to whether or not carrying out the sentence would be a miscarriage of justice, the execution did not take place until sunset instead of dawn, as is the custom in Illinois. This gave Church plenty of time to secure a further stay or a commutation of the sentence to life imprisonment, but he failed to get either. It can be said that when Church finally did go to the scaffold, he cheated the law. For 41 days he had gone on a hunger strike. It was necessary to feed him forcibly, and often while he slept to keep him alive. He sank into a coma 3 days before he was executed, from which it was impossible to arouse him. There was a death march. There always is. But Church was not among the marchers. 2 stalwart deputies carried him in their arms, and he went to meet his God, strapped to a chair, his head drooping forward on his chest. Now that it is all over and past history, were the state of Illinois and Cook County justified in the hanging of Church, or did they, in the name of justice, commit a crime no less grave, if less brutal, than the one for which Church paid the supreme penalty? And that was the hellish conclusion of License to Die, the strange tale of Harvey Church. I mean, it seems he was clearly insane and clearly a psychopath. I mean, I immediately think of the axe murder scene in American Psycho with Christian Bale. But I also know that awareness of mental health definitions in the 1920s was minimal compared to what it is today. I gotta tell you, the more murder stories I research, the more surprised I am how incredibly common axe murdering is. I used to believe it was almost a made-up thing, like the Mike Myers movie, So I Married an Axe Murderer, but no. There are so many axe murders, Hey guys, guess what? The upcoming episode this Sunday is actually Kinda Murdery's 100th episode. Thank you so much for riding beside me on this incredible journey we're on. I appreciate it, and I gotta tell you, this Sunday's episode is about none other than Charles Ponzi. I bet most of you are familiar with a Ponzi scheme, and you may or may not know that the Ponzi scheme is named after an actual man who invented it, an Italian immigrant to the United States named Charles Ponzi back in 1919. But what you may not know is that after he was convicted for his first Ponzi scheme, and after he served the time, he got out of prison, he went down to Florida, and he started selling plots of land for $10 a piece with the publicly announced intention of paying back his investors. Well, guess what? This was just another Ponzi scheme, this time built around real estate, and this time, when he gets called on it, Charles Ponzi goes on the lam. And that is quite a story. Please do join me on Sunday, October 2nd, for Kinda Murdery's 100th episode. That's right, 100 episodes. But we'll also be launching a new series. I hope you enjoyed Killer Couple. Well, coming up for the next few weeks, you'll hear Kinda Murdery's American Grifter, where we will cover crime and murder stories built around ingenious, dastardly confidence men. And who should we cover first? Well, the king of all matchstick men, the king who is also a pawn. That's right. Tune in Sunday, October 2nd for part 1 of American Grifter, Charles Ponzi. See you then. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery. If you've enjoyed today's Kinda Murdery, please tell your friends and family. Tell strangers. Leave a review. It's the best way to ensure that I can keep telling that special brand of bizarre and terrible tales that you'll only find here on Kinda Murdery.